Hello and welcome to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. Brussels versus the people. Voters all across Europe have sent a very strong message to the gatekeepers of the European Union. They must hand back power to the people. Political parties labeled as fringe and extremist by the establishment now reflect the wishes and hopes of millions of people and demonstrate a growing democracy deficit. To cross-talk the recent European elections, I'm joined by my guest, Robert Oulds in London. He is director of the Proje Group and author of Everything You Want to Know About the EU. Also in London, we have Andrew Lilico. He is a director and principal of the consultancy Europe Economics. And in Paris, we cross to John Laughland. He is the director of studies at the Institute of Democracy and Cooperation. All right, gentlemen, cross-talk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I very much appreciate it. John, if I go to you first in Paris, what is your reaction to the recent elections? Because the parties that were called fringe parties, extremists, nutcakes, they did quite well.
They did in France and Britain, and it's in these two countries that the result is the most spectacular. In France, the Front National came first with 27% of the vote, and UKIP, the United Kingdom Independence Party in Britain, came first with 25% of the vote. And in national terms, both these results are absolutely spectacular. It's particularly spectacular in Britain because UKIP is a new party. The Front National is quite an old party, and it's had good scores before, although this is its best ever. The situation in other European countries is less clear than this spectacular result in France and Britain. And I'm a well-known Eurosceptic and a well-known critic of the European Union, and particularly of its lack of democratic accountability. But I have to say that, unfortunately, the system is still very much intact. Yeah. Even though the tendency, yes, is towards protest, unfortunately, the system is still intact. The system is still very strong, and the big headline results that we've seen in France and Britain are not repeated in other European countries.
Andrew, in London, what does this all mean? Is this because a lot of people look at these elections and say it's just a protest, okay, against the establishment, to punish the establishment, to remind the establishment? Is it more than that?
I would say that outside the UK it won't mean a whole heap. Perhaps apart from France and the UK, the most interesting result in the night was the Italian result, where the Eurosceptics of Grillo were thoroughly trounced by the pro-European party of Renzi, the governing party. So, and across the EU as a whole, for all the talk of the rise of Eurosceptic groups, mainstream pro-EU parties won the vast majority of votes and seats in almost every EU member state. And I think at the end of the day, this will make very little fundamental difference to the direction of the EU for a number of reasons. First of all, because in addition to them having won most of the votes, the mainstream parties, the Eurosceptic parties are very disparate, disagree with each other, and are unlikely to form a coherent force because the mainstream parties will regard the votes for the Eurosceptic parties is really driven by economic anxiety and the problems of the recession, and they will expect them to fade away as we see recovery in the EU. And more fundamentally, because one of the key lessons learned from the Eurozone crisis is that the Eurozone comes under threat if there isn't adequate political, financial and economic integration. So they will see that the way to combat Euroscepticism is by having more integration, not less. And I would expect them to go full bore towards much greater, deeper integration over the next few years.
Robert, what's your reaction to all of this? I know you're a well-known Eurosceptic yourself.
Well, I think the result in Italy is because they've already had a change candidate. Their Prime Minister is, of course, seen as a breath of fresh air. So they didn't need to go to the polls to have a radical election result because they've already had the change candidate. But we've seen in Spain and, of course, in Greece, the emergence of Eurosceptic or parties that are of the left of centre that are opposed to the EU's austerity programme. Of course, the Syriza has been established for quite some time now in Greece. We know about them, but in Spain, there was a significant vote for people who are very sceptical about the euro and the EU's programme of austerity. And there could be some very interesting developments coming from those two countries because they are, of course, two of the countries that are suffering the most out of the eurozone and the ongoing crisis and the unemployment problems that still exist. So, of course, we know about Spain, we know about the economic problems there. Of course, France is also in deep economic crisis.
Robert, what's your reaction to what happened in the UK with UKIP? What is your reaction to that? Is that a trend?
Well, that is a trend. It's something that I predicted many years ago. At the last European elections, I thought that UKIP will actually win these polls. I don't really believe that they'll do so well at the general election, but that would be expected when, of course, the next general election in this country would be by a different electoral system and it'd have a different question. But the growth of Euroscepticism in this country is something that's been ongoing for several decades now, and that's expressing itself in terms of the opinion polls and, of course, at the European elections, where UKIP won the European elections in the UK.
John, it's reflect upon what Andrew just said, because it's very interesting, because these disparate groups are unlikely to unite, at least coherently. But what that will do is incur even a more intensive integration. I mean, this is a great deal of tension here.
Yes, I agree with Andrew's diagnosis. I think we're coming at this from different starting points, but I think he's right to say that the anti-EU groups are not going to agree, and in particular, of course, the two biggest ones, UKIP and the French Front National, are not going to sit together, as far as we can tell, in the European Parliament. So yes, I think that to the extent that we can identify a trend, it is yes between a political class, and I underline the word a political class, because I'm of the firm view that there is one political class now in Europe which governs us, and that all these peripheral parties, even though they disagree, are opponents of this one united class, united, of course, across nations and united between left and right. Indeed, the union between left and right may even come to be in the European Parliament, in the sense that there might be some kind of grand coalition between the centre-right and the centre-left. We may well see centre-right people, for example, voting for a centre-left Commission president. So it is correct to say that these groups squabble among themselves, but it is also correct to say, I think, that the European elite, this single class, will continue to press ahead. But that's, I think, where disaster lies, because the project is clearly failing.
Okay, Andrew, the project is clearly failing.
I wouldn't agree with that. I mean, I do think that the thought that you could maintain the EU as it's currently constituted for much longer is unlikely to be sustainable, in the sense that once by 2020 we're scheduled to have all but 5 of the current EU members be members of the euro, and I think that by that point the idea of being outside the euro and part of the EU is unlikely to be sustainable, because that will really mean that you just obey all of the rules of the single market set by the eurozone without having any particular say over what they are. And for countries like the UK, that's just not going to be acceptable. In the end, I think all of those countries that currently think they might stay out of the eurozone will have to choose between joining the euro and leaving the EU. I would expect most of them to choose to join the euro. UK will be likely to leave the EU altogether. I think much of the UK discussion about leaving the EU is rather moot, in the sense that there's just not going to be any non-eurozone EU for much longer anyway. Within the EU, I would expect that the movement towards much greater political integration, it may well cause a flowering, in fact. I think that there's a good chance that they will put behind them the travails of the past few years, once they have much deeper political and financial and economic integration, and that the 2020s could even be a real boom time for the European Union. This new, or Europa, or whatever this new single European state will be called. I'm quite optimistic about the medium-term outlook. The 2010s will be a very dull decade, very slow growth, perhaps even Japanese-style quiescence in the Eurozone. But once they get through that, I think they'll have a good chance of recovering quite fast, because I don't think there's any intrinsic reason why a single European state shouldn't work.
Okay, John, you're disagreeing very strongly. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I've made a career out of saying why I think that a European state cannot work. I believe that nations cannot be diluted and destroyed. I believe that they are one of the most important political facts, and I think that this is just fantasy. But I think more importantly, I don't see any move towards the creation of a European state. In 2005, when the first step was supposed to have been taken towards the creation of a state with the ratification of the Constitution, as everyone knows, that Constitution was rejected in France and in the Netherlands. And European leaders ever since then have not gone back there. They have not not ever gone back towards this idea of creating a state with a constitution. They have instead pursued integration by the back door, which was the tried and tested method. That is to say that they increasingly undertake policies together, but they never take a step towards statehood. It's very important that the viewers understand that these votes for the European Parliament are, of course, unlike any other election in the world. They are not votes for a government. The European Parliament does not have any governing powers. It hardly even has legislative powers. And that suits the European elite well, because the way to understand the European Union is that it is a cartel of governments acting against the interests of its respective electorates. That's the political model which worked well from the 1950s onwards.
If it looks like a duck and it wasn't like a duck, it's probably a duck,
abandoned in people's minds in 2005, and which will continue after that.
Let me go to Robert before we go to the break here. Robert, do you want to reflect upon what, because we have two very strong different views here. Go ahead.
Well, yeah, exactly. The European Union is there to sit above the governments of the member states and tell them what to do and control their actions, to have standardised policies from Ireland to Estonia, from Portugal to Finland. It is not about democracy, and we know from the European Parliament that it cannot initiate legislation, it cannot repeal legislation, it can't even adequately stop legislation. It can amend it at times and make it even worse, but it doesn't actually result in the creation of a government. The European Parliament is not a proper democratic institution, and neither is the EU democratic. It is a clique. It is as was described earlier, it is a cartel where the European elite, the bureaucratic class, and the elected representatives of the member states sit down together and decide policies without having to have public scrutiny.
All right, I'm going to jump in right here, gentlemen. We're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on European politics. Stay with our team. Okay, Andrew, I'd like to go back to you in London. John Laughland said something very interesting in the first part of the program about, left and right and how they would could possibly have some kind of grand coalition. It seems to me this is dissolving. The left and right paradigm is dissolving, and it's more if you're pro-system or anti-system. Are we coming up with a new political language because of this, or should we?
I don't really think so. And I think there obviously is a little bit of, to what extent are you in favour of the European project, or to what extent are you against it? But since most people right across the European Union are in favour of greater integration, it's really the outsiders are a small minority of the total, and the rest of them can afford to argue amongst themselves. And I don't agree with the proposition made earlier that it's impossible to dissolve nation states. In the case of the United Kingdom, for example, we have had a very successful union of multiple nations. So we haven't needed to have that you had a Scottish country just because you had a Scottish nation. That hasn't been thought to be necessary up to now. Similarly, you could have a Welsh nation or a Cornish nation or many other kinds of nations successfully operating within the United Kingdom. In much the same way, I don't see any reason why you have to think it's necessary for there to be governments that correspond to the nations of Europe. We can have different languages and different cultures.
Absolutely, it is fundamentally important to
structure in
democracy.
the EU.
Okay, Robert, jump in. Go ahead.
Well, I just don't see it as important at all. It hasn't been important in the United Kingdom. That's just wrong.
Go ahead, Robert.
There, in the United Kingdom, there has been a common language. There has been a common monarchy, which going back to 1603, it is absolutely fundamentally important to have the nation state. It is the only bedrock through which democracy can function, where people have a common set of values, have common interests, and will work together, will be willing to absorb the costs of a less well-off part of the country and distribute resources. It is the only way that it works. In the European Union, it is far too diverse, far too different interests, where people are different countries. Even still, in the European Union, most people do not speak a common language, do not have a common set of ideals, might want different things from the government. That is why it just cannot really work. A European Union cannot work when Europe is so diverse. We know about how the Eurozone is, of course, has many different economic aspects to it, how there's some parts are in growth, some parts are doing less well off, and of course is very economically diverse. You could actually have a random collection of countries from around the world, and that would beginning with them, and they would actually be better suited to have a single currency than the members of the European Eurozone. It doesn't actually work.
But within the European Union, we have found that there's political willingness to share
Robert, let's go
burdens.
to Andrew. Let's be fair
But
on
it's
this
not
program.
working.
Go ahead,
It's
Andrew.
not working. People
Go
do
ahead.
not support it.
No, we're going to Andrew now. Go ahead.
But within the Eurozone, we have seen that people have been willing to share burdens, and I believe that they will be willing to share burdens much more in the future. I agree with Robert to the extent that there are parts of the European Union, in particular the United Kingdom, which are sufficiently culturally and constitutionally and historically different from other parts of the European Union that you couldn't successfully form a state. But amongst the Eurozone members, I think that there is sufficient homogeneity and willingness to make it work, that they could, by and large, I think that they will be able to have quite a good confederate type arrangement. Nothing quite as deep as the United States of America. I would call it a confederacy rather than a federal arrangement. But I do think that
the Germans do not want to bail out Greece. The Greeks do not want to be told what to do by the Germans.
Okay, let me jump in here. John, go ahead.
Well, I mean, I totally disagree with that. I think that the fusion of nations in the way that Andrew sees the future of Europe can be bought only at the price of less democracy. There can never be a proper democratic union of nations. And I certainly don't agree that the continental nations of Europe are so similar to each other that, they can somehow be dissolved in a way that the British cannot. I mean, that is just fantasy. That is echoing in a sense, the worst propaganda of the most hardened British Eurosceptics. As Robert has just said, the venom and the hatred that has broken out between Germany and Greece in the Euro crisis is something to behold. If you go to Greece, you will get a sense of it. And I think the other aspect where I'm afraid the vision of ever closer union sailing gracefully onwards into the federalist future that Andrew has portrayed comes up against a very major problem, and that is the problem of France. Because one of the big issues, as I said in my first remarks in this election, is the electoral result in France. The National Front taking 27% of the vote, the governing Socialist Party taking 14% of the vote, which I think must be some kind of record for an incumbent party. And in the meantime, the centre-right pro-European UMP party is basically imploding as a result of internal political factors and because of a corruption scandal. There is a very febrile atmosphere in France, and I do not at all rule out that some kind of radical change could take place in this country. And if that happened, and of course also if the United Kingdom were to leave, as Andrew says it might, then I think that the European project could definitely unravel in a very serious way.
Andrew, we have the two countries, France and the UK here, two critical countries for the European Union.
Well, I don't think that.
Go ahead.
I don't actually see the UK. I don't believe that the UK is a critical country for the European Union any longer. I don't think that's been true for 20 years. In the case of France, I would say that the Front National did particularly well, but it did well by playing against the government's austerity. So what had happened was that Hollande had come in and been elected on the basis that he didn't need to be cutting back on the deficit as had been done elsewhere in places like the UK, and that the French had a different, unique way. He found that wasn't going to work, and so he reversed his policy, and the Front National successfully represented his reversal of policy as being something that was imposed on the French by the euro. So I would see it as being quite a passing problem that you have there in France. It doesn't mean the Front National will go away. They've been around for decades, of course, but they rise quickly and they fall away quickly as well, where in slightly better economic times or when the government is delivering more. So I think that a bit more delivery on economic growth and so on for the French, a bit of unemployment coming down, and you will see that the parties of the centre start to reassert themselves quite successfully. And I think a lot of this comes down to your analysis of how well can the European Union be made to work ultimately. I think that it can. I also think that there is quite a high willingness on the part of many of the member states of the EU to see decision making being made at the European level, provided it delivers economic growth and so on. If it fails to do that, then and there are democratic concerns about that. I do agree that as we move towards deeper political integration,
it has failed to deliver economic growth.
Probably a directly elected president, for example.
Okay, Robert, I mean, again, it's all about results here, and, a lot of people will say and agree with John Laughland, this is, the results go to the very small minority at the top, these elites here, but not for everybody else. I mean, there is something to that. Go ahead and jump in, Robert.
Yeah, Andrew was talking about economic growth in France, economic growth in the Eurozone, and how the 20s will look good for the EU. That is absolutely fanciful. There will be very little economic growth in the European Union over the forthcoming years. And if there's just another global downturn, Europe is not in a position to weather that at all, and it has massively high unemployment when budget deficits are still very high. Debt is enormously high within many Eurozone states, despite or perhaps because of the austerity measures. The European Union economic outlook is very poor indeed. Yes, there may be 1, perhaps even 2% growth in some countries over the next few years. That is not enough to get out of the vicious cycle that they are in. There needs to be radical changes. Otherwise, of course, when the next economic crisis hits, it will be especially damaging, considering that some countries already have 25% unemployment. There is very little capacity to take on board any other shocks, any other economic shocks that may emerge at any time in the near or medium term. And of course, the European Union is, of course, undemocratic. It cannot be made to work. People speak different languages. People have different interests. They have different
Let's talk about this democracy deficit here. Let me go to John Laughland in Paris. Talk about this democracy deficit here.
Well, I mean, it's a democracy deficit is a euphemism. There is nothing democratic about the European Union. The government of the European Union is not elected, that's to say the European Commission. Laws are made by governments, by national governments in the Council of Ministers, which violates one of the prime rules of democracy, which is that government shouldn't make laws. And the so-called parliament is, in fact, a complete farce and a facade. It's like the Supreme Soviet of the Soviet Union. It doesn't have any government accountable to it, and it basically doesn't have legislative power either. It doesn't, of course, have proper political parties. There are no pan-European political parties, and nor can there ever be. So when people say democratic deficit, that is a euphemism for an organisation which is radically anti-democratic. Its anti-democratic nature has been seen repeatedly because, like a serial killer, whenever there is a referendum that goes against the plans for ever closer union, this has happened now 5 times in the history of the European Union in the last 10 or 15 years. The European Union forces the member state in question to organise a second vote so that the answer is yes. We saw it in Denmark in 1992. We've seen it in Ireland in 2001 and in 2009, and of course in the Netherlands and in France in 2005. This is a power structure. It's a power structure serving an elite, and these people will do anything to hold on to
John,
power,
I want to be fair here. I want to give Andrew the last word on the program here. Go ahead, Andrew, 20 seconds.
So the EU is simultaneously the Democrats' club. So virtually all of the countries of the EU, 19 of the 28 countries of the EU joined the EU within 17 years of becoming democracies. And it's also a mechanism by which member state governments are able to deliver things which couldn't be voted for by their internal political structures. So they have free trade and liberalisation and lots of other things are delivered via the EU.
That can be done. That can be done without a political union. Look at the European Free Trade Association.
All right, gentlemen, we've run out of time. We didn't resolve anything. Interesting discussion. Many thanks to my guests in London and in Paris. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time, and remember, CrossTalk rules.
I love it.